People love to say 1950s war movies were just patriotic puff pieces. But here's the twist. Some of the boldest, most subversive war films ever made came out of that decade, and they didn't care whose feathers they ruffled. These movies questioned authority, exposed uncomfortable truths, and showed the kind of grit Hollywood usually tried to hide. So which ones dared to challenge the rules and still managed to pull it off? Well, you're about to find out. Attack 1956. When Attack hit theaters, it wasn't just another World War II movie. It was a cinematic middle finger to the idea that all officers were heroic leaders. Directed by Robert Aldrich, this one burned so many bridges with the Pentagon that the military outright refused to cooperate. No tanks, no uniforms, no official footage, nothing. They called it anti-American, a label that back then could crush a movie before it even opened. Set in Belgium during the Battle of the Bulge, the plot focuses on a dangerously incompetent officer, Captain Cooney, played by Eddie Albert. He's not a coward in the "I'm scared for my life" sense. He's worse. He's a man with political connections who gets promoted far beyond his abilities. And when the bullets start flying, his decisions cost lives. Opposite him is Lieutenant Costa, played by Jack Palance, a hardened combat leader who's had enough of Cooney's recklessness. When Costa's platoon is abandoned in a critical moment, the betrayal sets up one of the tensest revenge arcs of any war movie from that period. What makes Attack so ahead of its time is its willingness to go after the system itself. Most 50s war films painted a united, unwavering front between officers and enlisted men. This one made it clear, sometimes the most dangerous person on the battlefield isn't the enemy, it's the man wearing the same uniform as you. The realism wasn't accidental. Both Palance and Albert were World War II veterans, and Albert's real-life service record is nothing short of astonishing. He rescued 70 wounded Marines under fire during the Battle of Tarawa. In an ironic twist, this real hero was cast as a coward, while Palance, also a veteran, radiated raw battlefield authenticity. Critics loved it, audiences were stunned, and the Pentagon's anger only cemented its rebellious reputation. In a decade when Hollywood usually played it safe, Attack was proof that war movies could be brutally honest, even if it meant making powerful people very uncomfortable. The Enemy Below, 1957. At first glance, The Enemy Below sounds like standard 1950s fare, an American destroyer captain hunting down a German U-boat in the Atlantic. But this isn't just another good guys versus bad guys story. It's one of the first major Hollywood war films to treat the enemy not as faceless villains, but as human beings with their own code of honor. Robert Mitchum plays Captain Merle, an experienced but weary destroyer commander. His counterpart on the other side of the periscope is Kapitan von Stolberg, played by Kurt Jurgens. What's remarkable here is the balance. The film gives almost equal time to both men, showing their thought processes, their leadership struggles, and their shared understanding of the deadly chess game they're playing. Jurgens himself said later that this was the first time he'd seen a post-war American movie where a German officer wasn't portrayed as a caricature. And that wasn't just talk. The film brought in former U-boat officer Albert Beck as a technical advisor, making sure the submarine life was shown with authentic detail. Cramped quarters, tense silence, the constant threat of detection. The production avoided the stagey backdrops common in the era. They used real ships, real ocean shots, and practical effects for depth charges exploding in the water. Watching it now, you can still feel the tension in those moments when the destroyer sweeps overhead and the crew of the U-boat holds their breath, hoping they've stayed hidden. By the end, instead of delivering a triumphalist victory lap, the film leans into mutual respect. When the two commanders finally meet, it's not about gloating or humiliation. It's about recognizing that in another life, they might have been on the same side. In the 1950s, this was practically revolutionary. War films were supposed to be about winners and losers, heroes and villains. The Enemy Below asked a different question. What happens when both sides are just men trying to survive a war they didn't start? That moral complexity was rare then, and honestly, it still is. Decision Before Dawn, 1951. Most war movies from the early 1950s were still basking in the glow of victory, painting the Allies in broad, heroic strokes. Decision Before Dawn wasn't interested in that. Instead, it plunged into a murky, morally complicated corner of World War II, turning German prisoners of war into Allied spies. The story follows a young German medic, codenamed Happy, played by Oskar Werner, who volunteers to spy against his own country for the Americans. His mission? Cross back into Nazi-controlled territory and deliver critical intelligence before the war's end. It's a setup dripping with tension. Every step he takes could expose him as a traitor, and every face he meets could belong to a Gestapo informant. Director Anatol Litvak went for absolute realism. He shot the movie on location in bombed-out post-war Germany, using actual ruins and abandoned buildings as sets. No painted backdrops, no Hollywood polish. You see jagged walls, scorched rubble, and streets that still look haunted by the war's destruction. For audiences in 1951, it wasn't just a movie, it was a visual reminder of how fresh the wounds still were. The most striking thing? The film gives its German protagonist a voice and inner life. He's not there to be redeemed by an American mentor or conveniently martyred in the final act. He's complex, torn between loyalty to his homeland and disgust for what it's become. That conflicted humanity was rare for the time, especially in an American production just 6 years after the war. Critics loved its nerve, but it made the military and some viewers uneasy. The idea that Germans could be both victims and perpetrators didn't fit neatly into the post-war narrative America was selling itself. Box office numbers lagged behind its critical praise, and over time it faded from public memory. Still, Decision Before Dawn quietly paved the way for later spy dramas that embraced moral ambiguity. It proved that war films didn't have to be about massive battles or rousing speeches. Sometimes, the most gripping conflicts happen in the mind of someone who isn't sure which side he's really on. The Man Who Never Was, 1956. In the middle of the 1950s, when most Hollywood war stories relied on explosions and gunfire, The Man Who Never Was built its suspense on a corpse, a uniform, and one of the boldest acts of deception in military history. Based on the true story of Operation Mincemeat, the plot follows British intelligence officers as they plant fake invasion plans on a dead man, dress him as a Royal Marine, and let his body wash ashore in Spain. The hope? The Germans will find the documents and shift their defenses away from Sicily, making the Allied invasion there far easier. The brilliance of the film lies in how it makes a slow, bureaucratic mission feel like a ticking time bomb. Every decision, from choosing the body to forging his backstory, could mean the difference between fooling the enemy or tipping them off. It's espionage stripped down to its most delicate, dangerous essentials. For authenticity, the production leaned on the very man who orchestrated the real operation, Ewan Montague, who even appeared in a cameo. His insight gives the film a chilling sense of plausibility, and while the main cast wasn't packed with Hollywood megastars, Gloria Graham stood out, delivering one of her most nuanced performances. Unlike most war films of the time, The Man Who Never Was didn't need battlefield heroics. It thrived on precision, deception, and the quiet war waged in intelligence offices and enemy minds. That focus on brains over brawn was almost unheard of in 1950s American cinema, which was still selling the public on heroic charges and gunfire. Even today, it holds up as a masterclass in how to make espionage thrilling without losing its realism. And in a decade where subtlety was often buried under spectacle, this one proved that sometimes the most dangerous weapon in war is a good story, even if that story belongs to a man who never lived. Men in War, 1957. Anthony Mann was famous for his westerns, but in Men in War, he traded frontier towns for Korean hills and turned the genre's simmering human tensions into a war movie with teeth. It's one of the few Korean War films of the decade, and it cuts deeper than most WW2 stories because it's about survival, not glory. The setup is simple but brutally effective. Lieutenant Benson, played by Robert Ryan, leads a small, worn-down unit trying to reach Hill 465, where they're supposed to link up with the rest of their division. Along the way, they're joined, reluctantly, by Sergeant Montana, played by Aldo Ray, a gruff loner with a wounded colonel in tow. From the start, Montana and Benson clash over leadership, strategy, and trust. Mann's direction keeps the tension at a slow boil. The enemy is almost never seen. The real battle is between the men themselves, as exhaustion, mistrust, and the weight of survival chip away at discipline. This was a stark departure from the rah-rah patriotism of the time. Men in War shows soldiers as human beings who crack under pressure, who question orders, and who sometimes think about their own skin before the mission. Shot with sharp, almost documentary-like framing, the film feels more like you've been dropped into a patrol than like you're watching a Hollywood set. Its pacing and character focus would later influence Vietnam War films, especially those that showed the mental strain of combat over the spectacle of it. The military didn't exactly embrace it. Its refusal to paint a clean, heroic picture of the Korean War, a conflict already unpopular back home, meant men in war didn't get the kind of promotional push other war films enjoyed. But that rawness is exactly why it holds up today. It's not about winning a war, it's about getting through another day. And in that way, Men in War was decades ahead of its time. The Young Lions, 1958. On paper, The Young Lions looks like a star-studded woo epic. Marlon Brando, Montgomery Clift, and Dean Martin all in one film. But under the surface, it's a daring piece of 1950s American cinema that challenged almost every convention of the war movie genre. The story is split into three threads. Brando plays Christian Diestel, a German officer whose initial enthusiasm for the Nazi cause slowly crumbles as the reality of the regime sinks in. Clift plays Noah Ackerman, a Jewish-American soldier facing both the dangers of combat and the prejudice of his own countrymen. And Martin, in one of his first serious roles, plays Michael Whiteacre, a nightclub entertainer reluctantly drafted and forced to find his courage. What set the Young Lions apart was its refusal to stick to a single hero's journey. Instead, it gave equal weight to three vastly different perspectives, including that of a German officer, and let the audience decide where their sympathies lay. This was risky for a major Hollywood studio in the 50s. Cold War politics and lingering W2 bitterness made many viewers uncomfortable with anything that humanized the enemy. Behind the scenes, Brando was famously unhappy with how much the studio softened his character. He wanted to make Diestel darker, more morally compromised, but 20th Century Fox worried about alienating audiences in West Germany. Even so, Brando's performance is restrained and layered, and his scenes are some of the most haunting in the film. Clift, meanwhile, poured raw emotion into Ackerman's struggle against discrimination, and Martin surprised everyone with how convincingly he could play a man stripped of his swagger. The result was a film that didn't just tell a war story, it dissected the moral compromises and personal transformations war forces on people, no matter what side they're on. In an era when most American war films were content to be black and white morality tales, The Young Lions was all shades of gray. Fixed Bayonets, 1951. Samuel Fuller knew war. He fought in W tours, and when he made Fixed Bayonets. During the Korean War, he brought that first-hand experience to every frame. The film focuses on a small platoon ordered to cover a retreat through icy mountain terrain, fully aware that staying behind could mean never making it out alive. What's striking is how Fuller builds tension, not with constant action, but with the weight of inevitability. The soldiers talk openly about fear, doubt, and the grim possibility of freezing to death. This was unusual in the 1950s, when most war movies avoided showing troops as anything less than unbreakable. Fuller shot the film on a tiny budget, under $1 million, and mostly on a soundstage covered in crushed marble to simulate snow. Despite those limitations, it feels harsh and authentic. His casting choices helped. Gene Evans, who plays the tough but humane Sergeant Rock, wasn't a trained actor at all. He was a real Bayonets veteran Fuller had spotted in another role. That choice gave the film a naturalism most polished Hollywood productions couldn't match. Even though the studio forced Fuller to tone down some of the grittier moments to satisfy the production code, the film still resonated with veterans. The U.S. Army even used clips for training purposes, not to teach tactics, but to prepare soldiers psychologically for the kind of rearguard duty depicted. In a decade when Korean War movies were rare and often sanitized, Fixed Bayonets stood out for telling the truth about the cold, lonely, and terrifying side of holding the line. The Wooden Horse, 1950. While not as flashy as the prison break blockbusters that came later, The Wooden Horse quietly set the standard for realistic POW escape films. Based on a true story, it follows 3 British prisoners in Stalag III who devise an ingenious plan. Hide a tunnel under a wooden gymnastics horse they bring out into the yard every day. While one man vaults, others dig underneath, concealed from the guard's view. Unlike the adventurous tone of later escape films, this one is almost documentary-like in its realism. There's no swelling orchestral score to signal triumph, no improbable action scenes. Digging is slow, dangerous, and exhausting, exactly how veterans described it. That authenticity came from using real-life POW accounts to guide the screenplay. Though it was a British production, It found distribution in the US and earned respect from American veterans who saw their own experiences reflected honestly on screen. It lacked big stars and a massive budget, but it didn't need them. The story's quiet determination carried the film. In the US, marketing teams tried to sell it as a thrilling adventure, but the understated pacing confused audiences expecting Hollywood-style spectacle. Still, its influence lived on in films like The Great Escape, which borrowed more than a few elements from The Wooden Horse. The Desert Fox, The Story of Rommel, 1951. Portraying a German general as anything other than a villain was almost unthinkable in 1951 America, but The Desert Fox went there. James Mason stars as Erwin Rommel, the brilliant tactician of the North African campaign, shown here as an honorable soldier who becomes involved in the plot to assassinate Hitler. This was a bold choice for 20th Century Fox. The studio knew it would spark controversy, and it did. In the US, audiences, especially veterans, responded positively, impressed by the depiction of Rommel as a man torn between duty and conscience. In the UK, though, reactions were much frostier, with some veterans groups protesting the perceived sanitizing of his role in the war. Mason plays Rommel with quiet intensity, avoiding bombast and focusing on the moral weight of his choices. The film doesn't excuse him, but instead asks the audience to consider the complexity of serving under a regime you secretly oppose. It did well enough in the States to inspire a follow-up 2 years later, The Desert Rats, which told a more conventional Allied-centered story. But The Desert Fox remains the braver of the two, a film willing to humanize a man history had largely reduced to a label. Pork Chop Hill, 1959. By the late 1950s, Hollywood was starting to grapple with the Korean War in earnest, and Pork Chop Hill hit with the force of a gut punch. Directed by Louis Milestone, who had helmed All Quiet on the Western Front, this film zeroes in on one of the war's most grueling and politically charged battles. Gregory Peck stars as Lieutenant Joe Clemens, tasked with leading a company to retake a strategically meaningless hill in the final days of the war. The mission is dangerous, the terrain is unforgiving, and the political stakes are murky at best. What made Pork Chop Hill stand out was its refusal to romanticize the fight. The film makes it clear that men are dying over a patch of land that won't matter in the peace talks already underway. The battle sequences are raw and chaotic, emphasizing confusion and exhaustion over choreographed heroics. Milestone's direction blends battlefield realism with an undercurrent of cynicism about the larger political machinery. In the 1950s, that was a bold statement, suggesting that soldiers' lives could be spent for reasons that had nothing to do with victory. Peck's steady, understated performance anchors the film, while the supporting cast, including a young Woody Strode and George Shibata, brings depth to the diverse faces of the American military. In the end, Pork Chop Hill is less about winning a battle and more about surviving the absurdities of war. For 1959 audiences, that was a sobering and very modern message. So there you have it, 10 war films from the 1950s that didn't just tell war stories, they reshaped them. These weren't propaganda pieces or sanitized history lessons. They were bold, unsettling, and often way ahead of what audiences were ready to hear. Which one of these do you think holds up the best today? Or is there another 50s gem you'd put on this list? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you want more deep dives like this, you know what to do.